So as she said, I am Jessie Wusthoff. I am at Clover Health. The health is important because everyone thinks of the dairy company. So we are a Medicare company. We are a Medicare/technology company. I've been doing this work for a few years now, and my biggest passion is disability and getting people to talk more about disability. So this is a little different than a traditional workshop in that the exercises will really be more reflection exercises. I want to make sure people understand kind of what this is and what it isn't. It's not a legal workshop. I am not a lawyer. So we will mainly be talking about how to engage in these conversations and how to understand what's holding us back from these conversations. Sound good? Okay, awesome. I'm also going to be giving a verbal next slide cue. For those of you who aren't able to see the slides up here, I will verbally be going over what they contain, which is a good kind of inclusive best practice. So go ahead and we'll kick it off. Yay, Google for Entrepreneurs. Next slide. We're looking for the color purple. Okay, that's me. Okay, here we go. Okay. So, more than meets the eye, new direction for conversations on disability. So, why are we here today? Other than we're at a conference, we're learning about inclusion, but why are we here trying to talk about disability today? Or why are you here in this event? There's going to be a lot of this, a lot of non-rhetorical questions. Shout it out. Yep, it's just not talked about. We talked about gender, we talk about race. We're getting better about talking about intersectionality of those two things, but we don't talk about as much else as we need to, such as age and disability. What percentage of the population has a disability? Ooh, 40, 33, 6, 21. These are a range. I mean, the fact it's such a range, we don't know. I mean, we really don't know, so it's 19. So it's about 19. What percentage of the workforce has a disability? A lot less. A lot less. I mean, that's really all you need to know. The unemployment rates are significantly higher for people with disabilities. And some of you might think, well, like that makes sense because someone with whatever disability comes to your mind couldn't do whatever job comes to your mind. However, in my experience, it's actually the bias. I actually interviewed an HR director candidate a while back, and I asked her, well, we want to hire people with disabilities. How do you go about that? And I'll refer to this part later, but basically the answer was, well, I start by thinking about what jobs they can do. Vetoed. Not going to be our HR director. So I'm going to refer back to that example later on. We can go to the next slide. So our goals of today is basically to increase our understanding about disability in the workplace to help us focus on the people and the skills and not the disability. Next slide. We're going to do that by understanding this higher perception kind of social framing around disability. We're going to talk about understanding our own personal view. That's why I had you start with the exercise on the worksheet for those of you who are here early enough. And then decide your own personal next steps. It is essential that we all leave this room with a couple tangible steps that we are going to take. Next slide. All right, so just to do some framing, this is the US government's definition. I will say if you have international companies, it's important to adjust the definition to resonate with your international audience. But basically it points out that it is a physical or mental condition that substantially limits a major life activity. That's what the word you couldn't see say. All right, so what is a major life activity? You're going to think of some obvious ones. Being able to see, being able to hear are things that will impact a daily major life activity, but there are also things like sitting in a chair all day. That impacts what kind of jobs you can do, right? Being able to be in loud environments. That impacts what kind of work environment you can be in. So I do find this definition limiting, but it's important for us to kind of sync on how the government thinks of it. Next slide. So why is talking about disability so hard? This is going to be one of those non-rhetorical questions. So what is so hard about it? Safe space. It's scary. Why is it scary? It's different. Yep. Privacy. You don't know if someone wants to talk about it. You might not want to talk about it if you're the person with the disability. What else? Yep. The best intentions can hold us back the most. If you want to do this conversation well, you're actually less likely to have it because you're so nervous, right? I think it's all of these things. I also think part of it is that the word disability is pretty meaningless. It is the same word used to describe someone with a prosthetic leg like myself, someone with PTSD, someone with a hearing impairment. Those things have nothing in common. Even within one disability, the experience is significantly different. So if you don't even know what basic language to use, how likely are you to engage in a conversation? Pretty unlikely, right? So generally the preferred language, just to let you know, is person with disabilities. People will have very strong differences of opinion, but if that's your default, you're in a pretty safe space. I actually have heard people say, I'm a disabled person. When you try to change the language, I find it like belittling to my experience. This is the terminology I grew up with. And I've heard people say, if you say person with a disability, then, if you say like different rate, it's like a differently abled, like that's force stacking and force ranking. So good luck with that, because if we as a community cannot agree, it does make it intimidating. So power through that. Person with disabilities is great. So it means a lot of different things. There's also a huge social stigma. So why is it that companies doing great diversity and inclusion work in some categories are still not doing disability work? They don't think of it in part because it's like a taboo topic. There's a stigma around it. You're not supposed to talk about that. And I'll talk about one of the social models that helps perpetuate that. There is also a lot of trust involved. Around 70% of disabilities are invisible. So I just have to know, if you tell me, I just have to trust it. Some of us are more trusting than others, and that's okay. But that creates another roadblock. I don't know you from you. I don't know which one of you is just gonna be like, I trust you 100%, and which one of you is gonna be, I don't see it, I don't believe it type of approach. I've had both bosses. So it's definitely part of the process. You already touched upon people not wanting to offend, that's part of it. And how many of you want to get sued? Not me, I don't have time for that. So that's definitely in the workplace, that makes it harder to learn as well what people's experience is, and I'm gonna talk about a way around that towards the end as well. Next slide. How many of you have taken Harvard's implicit bias test? Awesome. Okay, how many of you have taken the one around disabled versus abled preference? All right, let's get the same number of hands up next time. So one of the action steps I recommend is to take this test. You will be surprised by your results, just like you generally are for all of these tests. So for those of you who can't see the text on the slides, there are 3 bars that have 37, 27, 14% labeled. Those 3 bars collectively are people who, and this is the test language, people who prefer abled over disabled people. Imagine being a person with a disability and knowing over 80% of people, and this theoretically is a representation of a broader audience, have a preference for not you. I can tell you that feels crummy. That feels super crummy. How much does that make me want to engage in talking about my disability? These conversations are not only uncomfortable for the person without the disability, and let's keep it real, and for the same reasons I've already talked about. There's one thing you leave with today, just one. It's to be comfortable with being uncomfortable. It is okay to be uncomfortable. No one ever died from feeling kind of uncomfortable. That's okay. That's okay. So the middle bar, 14%, that's people who have no preference for able versus disabled. And then at the bottom percent, you have, it's like 8, it adds up to, 9%. That's people with a preference for disabled over able. So if 19% of the population has a disability, I just really hope they didn't take this survey, because that means we also have biases against ourselves. And I actually do know for a fact that that can be true. Society gets us too, right? All right. So this is the most depressing slide. I promise it gets better from here. Next slide. Oh, the animation didn't work. That's okay. Here's all your cheats for what these models are. There's 3 main social models. If you're trying to do research about kind of social views of disability, these are the 3 that are gonna come up the most. So the first one is the medical model. Disabled people are patients. They go into medical centers, not public spaces, and there's a lot of shame. They aren't shown. This is a very 19th century model, but there are definitely countries where this is still the prevalent model. A tragedy model. People with disabilities are unfortunate. They need to be protected. They don't need to work. They don't need to work. And it is socially positive to show sympathy toward people. This is kind of what the Special Olympics has become, even though that's not what it started as. And then this is something you'll often see, like churches, for example, or social clubs will often like make donations and do fundraising kind of under this model. I heard someone on a panel say that, say that when he was in elementary school, he had a teacher, he was struggling in like in a subject, and he had a teacher be like, don't worry about it, the government's gonna take care of you. Lowered expectations are kind of the worst thing you can do. Forget all your nerves about language. Lowered expectations for people with disabilities, people of color, people like, that's the worst thing you can do to someone, because then we absorb it, internalize it. The social model, disability's consequence of environment, not the actual person, and legal perspective. It's really about a legal perspective about equal access. People are put in a bucket, and that bucket is protected by the law. So you don't have to tell me which one, but raise your hand. How many of you feel like your view of disability fits cleanly into this bucket? Any of the buckets? All right, one. How many of you feel like your view kind of merges between a couple of the buckets or isn't even up here? Most of you. Okay, great. So generally, the social model is the most contemporarily developed, but even it leaves some things out. Next slide, please. It leaves out that each person has a story. We are people. People have stories. It leaves out the personal impact. I talked about the example about being told in elementary school not to worry about doing well in school. That will carry through. And the on confidence, I do want to say one thing. It is not that people with disabilities cannot be confident. I have a disability and I'm pretty confident. However, there is a huge impact, and I think some of you relate to this for different reasons or possibly the same reason, when someone is constantly telling you to do less, worry about things less, that you're capable of less. I had at one of my jobs, a couple jobs ago, I had in like above level performance review. I was feeling pretty good, switched my manager. Within a couple months, she told me she didn't see how I could do my job with my disability. And I thought, but I have done all right. So that's the kind of thing that we're going up against. So one thing you can do is just not do that, basically. I had already delivered, I had already done my job, and it wasn't like I'm so impressed, I don't see how you can do your job with your disability, which would have been patronizing and problematic, but it was like even worse than that. So definitely if you're a people manager or if you're collaborating with people, keep that in mind, please. All right. Then there's also the emotional stages of your own understanding. So part of it is sometimes people will ask me, this person has a disability. If you look at the definition, if you look at how people with this same diagnosis identify, it's usually as a disability, but they don't. How do I engage in the conversation with them? What do you think the answer is? You just meet them where they are. Meet them where they are. I have had a prosthetic leg since I could walk. I did not use the word disabled to describe myself until like 5-ish, 6, maybe 7 years ago. And it took being on a walkabout in the Australian outback and envisioning the life flight helicopter coming at me, panting, heart coming out before I was like, my body has limitations, as I'm like watching everyone kind of like walk by me, right? Like my body actually hadn't changed any more than any person's like 15-year-old body to 25 or 20, whatever, how old I was, body changes, right? But I had to be in that extreme of a situation to be like, cool, I'm a little bit in denial about things about my body. And why? Because I also have stigmas, and I'm also afraid of other people's stigmas. I'm so afraid. When I was in a job where like literally my worst fear happened and I was like kind of tangibly discriminated against, that was the first job where I checked the box as being disabled because I was so afraid of being discriminated against. And one of the most freeing things in my life was once I was discriminated against, all right, I might as well check the box. It's fine, you know, move on from here. That is why I do this talk today, that experience. So there are the emotional stages of your understanding. Just meet someone where they are. That's their journey. You never ever, regardless, like whether it's a disability or not, you don't force someone to identify with a certain word, right? And then the pressure of educating others. How many of you have ever felt the pressure of educating others about your demographic or your identity? How many of you like it? Exactly. It's not fun. My job is diversity and inclusion, and even I am not always up for these conversations, right? That is human, that is fair. They do not have to educate you. One of my slogans is, if you can Google it, you should Google it, right? All right, next slide. So real quick, does anyone have any questions so far? Beginning's a little bit more of me talking. All right, so we're gonna go ahead and do an exercise. So we'll start with, if everyone who is able to please stand. If you do not want to stand or you don't want to, then go ahead and raise your hand. Just some visual hand up or standing is helpful. All right, so I want you to think about how many people you know, and by know, not blood relative. It can be a work friend, and when I say work friend, it's the person you like go to the bathroom with. It's to like vent or whatever, or like a real friend, not like, oh, I happen to know your name. Sit down or lower your hand if you don't know anybody you would identify as in that group as having a disability. One person, go ahead and sit down or put your hand down. 2. And you know them well. 3. All right, everyone sit down. So a lot of people sat down or put their arm down at 2. That's the norm, basically. Usually, sometimes you lose a lot of people at 1, usually it's 2. And when I said that you know well, a lot more people sat down at 2, right? Once you kind of like admit that to yourself, like, oh, I guess I really don't know that much, like, we don't talk about very personal things. So that was really interesting. Vast majority of the time, 2 people sit down. So what does that mean? Not rhetorical. People aren't disclosing, because y'all know way more people than 2 who have disabilities. 19%, remember? People aren't disclosing. What else does it mean? Yeah, so you don't know. They're not employed. There's a reality check, yep. How about in those personal relationships? All right, so part of it is because, a lot of it is because you don't know, but think about the person you do know the most out of that group. Most of you knew at least one person you would identify with as a close friend or a contact. So think about that one person you know the best. Again, not a blood relative. Now, how much do you know about their disability? This is rhetorical, so you can go ahead and just internally. How much do you actually know about what their disability is? When did their disability start? A lot of disabilities happen later in life. So when did their disability start? What are some of the ways they adjust their physical environment or don't adjust their physical environment because of their disability? Who do they talk to about their disability? And then how do they feel about talking about their disability? Raise your hand if you can confidently answer all of these questions. Okay, so a couple people, most of us know. So even those of us who have multiple relationships are relying a lot on stereotypes or a very short list of people when we're kind of building our understanding of a bigger group of people. Does that make sense? Any questions right now? Okay. So looking at your worksheet, I had a couple questions, and I put this out because I want you to start thinking about where you need to push your your kind of self-learning, and where you need to increase your comfort just enough, because you're going to be uncomfortable, but just enough to still engage and be an ally and support people, right? When I say support people, I mean stand behind or stand next to, not in front of. People get to own their own stories. All right, so the first one, your new housemate has a prosthetic leg. Just think to yourself. And then your best friend is diagnosed with MS. Any ideas about why you would be more comfortable with one of those versus the other? Yep, because, and you could have interpreted new housemate as kind of different level of familiarity, but if it's your like best friend, you know that person and you're still gonna think of the person before the diagnosis. If you don't necessarily know a new roommate, if you're calling them your roommate, for example, you probably don't have a previous relationship, you're gonna have a lot more of a struggle thinking about person before disability. Does that make sense? Okay. And then looking at the last two, a work friend tells you they have PTSD, and then your work sends out an email talking about the importance of mental health in recognition of Mental Health Awareness Month. How many of you have different comfort levels with those two situations? I do. And why are these so different? Because one does relate to a person. The second one, the employer sends out an email. You don't actually have to interact with that. You're not required to be part of a dialogue. It's just information that came to you, right? It's more abstract. I also am going to be really explicit. We do have more stigmas around mental health. When people hear PTSD, they think very specific things that are rarely accurate, right? PTSD can be from a whole lot of things. All right. So you have this flyer to keep, so you can do some more reflecting, and I think that's one of the questions you can ask yourself is, why do I feel this way here and I feel this way here? If you don't feel comfortable with something and your answer is because I don't know much about this, that's where Google is your friend. All right. So going back to how many people you know related to both the worksheet and the questions I was asking you before, if we're building these stereotypes on a short list, one of my questions is that okay because you still have a bunch of representation of disability around you in media and things like that? So here's my question. This group, given the context, this group actually might do pretty well at this, but if you can shout out some names of like high profile public figures that like people know, like generally people know have a disability. Stephen Hawking, Christopher Reeve, two very common ones. I don't know who that is. Okay, TED Talk. Oh, okay, I know what you're talking about. What did you say in the back? I don't know yeah, but I don't know the disability. How many of you knew Anthony Hopkins was autistic? All right, that's pretty good. Well, okay. For a couple of you, I'm like, all right, I know. Okay. That's still not that many, right? If I asked you to think of like, let's keep it real, a white, able-bodied male actor. Oh, Robin Williams is another one that's come up recently. Like, but you could do a lot more if you were like taking out disability from the equation and going with these majority groups. You could say a lot more. Stevie Wonder's the other one that's named all the time. So Michael J. Fox is one of the ones I really like, and Selena Gomez has also recently, someone said Kanye last time, because he did come out and talk about mental health issues not that long ago, a couple months ago. Demi Lovato as well. So when we really think about it, we can kind of get there, but a lot of these names I mentioned towards the end are people that like became famous and then, right? These aren't people that like started their career talking about this openly. These aren't people who had visual disabilities and were still getting jobs, right? And so I think that's important when we're talking about your experiences and your filters. They're gonna be limited unless you're going after them and educating yourself. All right. And part of that is related to why these things require trust, right? You don't have a lot of things you can look at. You don't have a lot of things you can fall back on sometimes when your exposure is limited, so just go through with trust. Okay, so next slide is actually gonna give me a chance. Any questions right now? All right, this is giving me a chance for my voice to break, and we're gonna watch just a couple minutes of a video real quickly. This is Lisa Bradshaw. She is, she's from South Africa. She's gonna respond, she's gonna talk about the 2%. That's the government requiring companies there to have 2% employment for people with disabilities. And I think that's all and she'll say Joburg, that's Johannesburg. All right, I think that's it. One minute 20. Thank you.
Our value. We can't judge people based on our stereotype understandings. So I asked the question, why is it that people still approach me with that sing-song pity voice and give me the cognitive credibility of a 5-year-old. And they come and say, hello, and what's your name? I mean, just the other day, flying up to Joburg, it was this week, in fact, I get lifted off the little skinny chair and I get put onto the seat, and they take the wheelchair away, and this lady leans over and she goes, Shame, lovey, are you okay? So I said, yes, I'm fine, thank you. She goes, oh, shame. And then she says, are you going to Johannesburg on holiday? And I said, no, I'm going up on business just for the day. Wait, you work? And I said, I do. And she goes, it just shows you people are so brave. And I look and I think, really? I'm not a firefighter. I'm just going to work, really. You get credibility for doing absolutely nothing. I'm buying a pumpkin the other day at Fruited Veg City, and someone told me I was courageous. And I said, well, what's wrong with the pumpkin? And you kind of got to ask yourself, why is it that I'm getting credibility here for not doing much? So you give it a bit of thought and you realize it's because people have set very low benchmarks of expectations for people with disabilities. So if you do something normal, people go, wow, you champion. And you go sort of going, not so much, really. Okay, and why is this? It's because we don't understand disability, because we see the disability and we judge people's abilities based on that. Okay, now the problem in the workplace is if you have low benchmarks, then you don't see the value that the person can actually add to your organization. So what happens is you panic a bit. So the labor department goes, you must reach your 2%. And you go, all right, and you dash out and you go, but, ooh, yeah, I don't know about this, because we're a very busy department. Can't really have disabled people here. It's too dynamic, it's too busy. Because you're judging it on your understanding of someone sitting in a wheelchair with a crochet blanket, perhaps pushing a bolt on a nut. That's not disability. And the other problem with that is we tend to assign which jobs we feel are suitable for people with a disability. So the starting strategy of a company doing a disability inclusion process is we go, well, now which positions are suitable for the disabled? And usually it's like switchboard, call center. Okay, and my question is, do you also say, well, which positions in our company are suitable for black people? When you say that, people go, hey, that's not right, that's discriminatory. And I go, well, why? Well, because in the category of black people, so to speak, there is such a vast arrangement of different potentials and skills and knowledge and personalities and motivation. So you can't say which positions are suitable for black people. So why is it okay to decide which positions are suitable for disability and people with a disability? It's because you are thinking blind, deaf, and in a wheelchair. So you're thinking from a functionality perspective. Well, the reality is disability includes a huge, wide range of impairments which may or may not disable you, depending on what context you're operating in, right? So here's the thing. We're 22 years
You
down
can go ahead
the
and
line
stop the
towards
video.
democracy. And we're still...
So I think she does a good job of adding humor to this conversation. There is, did you like the video? It's pretty good. There is one big problem with the video that I do want to call out. This idea of when you don't ask like what jobs would suit a black person, implicitly people do this. So I think that is really important to acknowledge. But even people who implicitly do this know not to explicitly ask. And with disability, they still explicitly ask. Also implicitly as well. So she's also in South Africa, so that is legit a thing. But I do want to call that out. That is kind of the problem with this video, is it assumes something isn't happening that we see in America as happening. And that's one of our systematic failures. Okay, thank you. All right, so where do we go from here? Any questions so far? Okay, so where do we go from here? Next slide. Sorry, I forgot to say that. All right, I love the empowering model. How many of you like to be empowered? How many of you like to make your own choices? Right? How many of you like to be in control? Too much. This is my favorite model because the person with the disability is in control and they are making their own decisions. These sound great. I like these things. That means about their medical choices. That means including financial choices about what they do, and it includes decisions in the workplace. So one of the questions I wrote on the workshop, and we're not going to have time to reflect too much on that, how many of you are familiar with your accommodation process at work? How many of you, out of you few people, how many of you would say it is following the empowering model? Literally everyone was like, not terribly, it's okay. What would the empowering model look like for your accommodation process?
A real interactive conversation that may be potentially led with an open-ended question, like what would work for you, as opposed to like, here are the things we can do for you.
Like a human dialogue. Yeah. I worked at a company and they moved it to a pure ticket system. I'm like, I'm not filling this out. I don't know who's seeing it. I don't know how private it is. You're asking me things that are illegal to ask me straight up. No. So human dialogue, like I get scalability is important. I get tracking is important. You can address both in a much more sensitive and human way. Going back to one of my earlier points, it's not just people without the disabilities who are uncomfortable sometimes. In my current job, which has been amazing around my disability, 2 weeks before I started, I was physically ill because I was dreading the conversation so much. I'm 35. It's not the first time I've had the conversation, but I was so afraid that it was going to be like a repeat incident of what things I'd had in the past, right? We need to work on our accommodation process, but we do have the human conversation as part of it. It also includes the open, like, how can we get you to where you need to be? But it also includes a list. I mean, people are going to ask some of the most common questions over and over. We've done the research. We have a list, and at the end of the list is, or a version that works well for you that you are welcome to tell us. Because it's not necessarily someone's job to go find like an ASL interpreter. We should have a list with a couple of different options. We should have a list of captioning services. We should have a list of all these things, right? And if my employee tells me like, actually, I've had a really negative experience with this vendor, we should have a plan B. So that's something that I do not find in any accommodation process, quite frankly. My facilities manager is awesome. We actually have an extensive list of ergonomic equipment, but also I myself was able to be like, none of these actually address one of my issue. Like, can I do my own thing? They're like, yep. The cost point was the same. Why not?
Love to know, and maybe follow up to this, is like resources, are those lists shared? Like, is there a common place to Google, like, what are some resources for reasonable accommodation or whatever?
That will be one of my action steps. That is a very important question, yes. Don't let me forget, I won't forget because it's on the slide. But yeah, so again, if you can Google it, Google it. It's frankly a lot more efficient for your facilities department to have ergonomic things. It's a lot more efficient for your HR team to already have a plan. If someone is not able to be in an open office environment sometimes, whether it's because they have anxiety, whether it's because they're sensitive to sound, for what, like there's many reasons that could be the case, just have a plan. Just have a plan so someone does not feel like they are a burden when they make a request. And you are empowering them, and if you say, this is a solution we've done in the past, will this work for you? If it doesn't, we are definitely open to other solutions. And you are empowering them and making it easy and efficient. I love efficient. All right, next slide. So your next steps, we're gonna go ahead and, and by the way, on your flyer, it does have the empowering model. I do have a couple sources. One of them no longer works, so I am looking to find a better source, but one of them does still work. So that is on there for you to refer to. And then this slide is also on the back side. Can you go back to next, I think there was one, yeah, this one. So your next steps, I want you to literally circle 2 on your flyer right now. If you don't have a pen, that's okay. But for those of you who have any sort of writing utensil, I want you to circle 2 of these things. The first is to take the implicit bias, the Harvard test on disability. That's the first. Really kind of own where you're coming from. Don't feel guilty, just learn to do better. How many of you took the implicit bias test and felt not great afterwards? I'll do it, I'll say it, don't feel great. So go ahead and do that. For more on the legal definitions, you can go to the eeoc.gov website if your role in your company is one where that's important. And then if you are in a position to do so, or even if you're not and you just want to kind of do some research and pass on, there is an organization, it used to be called US Business Leaders Network. They've rebranded this summer to Disability In. So disabilityin.org is their website. They have the Disability Equality Index. It is basically just like the Corporate Equality Index, which measures LGBTQ plus inclusion. This will measure disability inclusion. They give you all the questions for free. There's no reason to not start with this. I could not be more proud. We have a working group of not me who have like on their own started this and are working cross-functionally with everyone to make sure we have our best practices. My company is 7% people who identify as having disabilities. It's so exciting. It's so exciting. That's very high. And those are people who felt comfortable disclosing. We're gonna release that blog soon. So but we still hadn't done this survey, so it was like, we better make sure people feel supported, right? So get ahead of the game. They also have other programs you can look into. How many of you have heard of the show Speechless? How many of you watched the show Speechless, I should say? She has, because I made her. Like, I'll point out to that. It's super, super good. It's on Hulu. I verified last night that season 1 is still on Hulu. It is hilarious. And you can kind of tell that they only thought they'd have one season because they covered like everything. All the big topics in the first season. I think it's very, very well done. It made me feel very seen as a person with a disability. My favorite thing about it is the person with the disability is like a normal teenager and like everyone else is a ridiculous caricature. So like that contrast just felt really, really good to me. Season 2 and 3 are fine. But season 1 really touches upon this lower bar of expectation. This people get away with, like, the brother like who has a disability was being a jerk, but people were okay with it. It's like, do not lower the bar. Do not let him be a jerk type of thing. I can tell you right now that happened when I was a kid. My sister will also say that happened when I was a kid. So it touches upon some really important things in a really safe learning environment. So I highly, highly recommend it. Answering your question about workplace accommodations, Ask Jan, so AskJan.org is a gold mine for all things job accommodations. And it is a free gold mine, and you can call them for free, and they will talk you through something for free, free. So you can talk to them as an employer or as a person with this disability trying to figure out your accommodation. I can tell you my life would have been very different if I had known about this site 10 years ago, to be quite honest, because I was told I was asking for too much. I was asking for so little that a lawyer was like, that doesn't even count as an accommodation. Like I was asking for 4 hours of flexibility a week. And they were like, yeah, we're not gonna take your case because that's not an accommodation. That's just a thing. So it's very, very, like every single accommodation except for one in my entire career that I've heard asked for in any talk or in my jobs has been reasonable. And the one was like, you would know. It was like, you'd have to, like, it was like, we have to deliver 100 of these a day, and they were asking to deliver 10. So, it happens, but you know if it's a stretch, and guess what, it's probably not. And then I wanna make sure we wrap up. Follow Able Thrive on Facebook. I love this Facebook group. They had a great campaign that was #ThisIsHowI. I learned a lot from that. So these kind of like ongoing soft ways to be learning, following some groups on Facebook is a really good way to increase your exposure. Making something normal that is actually normal is one of the best things you can do. Are we out of time? Are people coming for the next session? Okay, 2 minutes, okay, great. Okay, next slide, last slide. All right, so one last thing about allyship. Sorry, next slide. So ethnic minority or female leaders who engage in diversity valuing behavior are penalized with worse performance ratings, whereas ethnic majority or male leaders who engage in diversity valuing behavior are not penalized for doing so. I say this at the end of almost every talk I give because all y'all have some sort of power to help make these conversations better. Even me as a disability, I'm white, I'm cisgender, I'm verbal, too verbal sometimes. I can use all of these powers and privileges to help make this conversation happen. All right, everyone in this room has one. Okay. This is not different for disability. I was also told at a job where I had tons of data to show the disability community was not doing well. They were not ranking high on our inclusion survey through Culture Amp. And I was told it was a pet project. So this is why if people, like, you can step up and you can help, right? My current job, in my interview, I said, please do not hire me if you're not gonna want me to work on disability. And that was before I knew it was 7% representation. All right, so We did go a little long, but not too long. There was a slide I think that went by pretty quickly, but it has on your worksheet. Remember to be an ally. Respect privacy. It's safe to assume, not just competence, but it's safe to assume that if someone is asking for an accommodation, they need it. Let's keep it real. Not everyone who has a disabled placard needs a disabled placard. But if for every 100 people who needs it, 2 people get it that didn't, we still need to give it to the 100 people. Hurts, but that's how it is. And pay attention. So I have a prosthetic leg. I usually wear pants, but I ride BART in the morning. How many times have I had someone ask me if I needed the seat? Once. And I think, honestly, it was because he barely beat me to it, and I made just a really sad face. And then he realized, like, between that stop and the next stop, like, oh, I get it now. So he paid attention, right? But it was probably half because I made just a really sad face. I was very tired that morning. So pay attention. The number of times, like, you see people on their phones on BART in the disabled seats while there's, like, a pregnant person in front of them who doesn't always want the seat. Like, they'll say no if they don't want the seat. Stinks. And then be a friend first. Meet people where they are. Support them in these convos how they want. All right. What questions do people have? Yes.
Hello, my name is Kenji. I'm a QA manager at Indeed. I'm curious, and I have a direct report who's deaf. So I'm curious, like, what, if anything, can we do as people leaders to help educate those around them on how to interact or make sure that we're providing the right accommodations?
Yeah, so basically, if you are providing an accommodation, people generally know when they're when they're at working age, they know that they need an accommodation. So they will ask for what they need. Check in with them every 3 months, 6 months, just to make sure it's working for them, right? That's something that I think means a lot to people. As far as those around them, work with your diversity, equity, and inclusion office and those people about, are they including these concepts into all of their trainings? Are they making sure everything around the company is accessible? I know only like 2 companies have released their disability stats. So if your company is not, odds are really high they're not including this population in their accommodation efforts. Okay. So work with that office to partner. It's not all on you. They should be supporting you appropriately. All right, we are out of time. I'm so sorry, but I will be here for another hour or 2, and I'll be in the hallway for just a little bit. Thank you so much. I really, really appreciate it.